January 1944, Northern Solomon Islands. Just after dawn. The Pacific sky is clear, pale blue, deceptively calm. A formation of Japanese fighters cruises at altitude, engines steady, pilots scanning empty air. For months, this routine has been familiar. Then, the enemy, when he appears, usually comes low and slow, predictable, manageable. Then the radios crackle. Shapes appear high above the sunline. Dock, heavy silhouettes dropping fast. Too fast. The Japanese pilots instinctively pull into climbing turns, expecting the usual dance. But the American fighters do not turn, they dive. The distance closes in seconds. A sudden roar. Thick streams of .50 caliber fire cut the sky apart. One aircraft erupts. Another spins away trailing smoke. The attackers flash past, already climbing again. Massive bent wings unmistakable now. These are not Hellcats. Not Wildcats. Something new. Something brutally confident. Inside Japanese cockpits, surprise hardens into alum. The enemy has brought a fighter that refuses to play by the old rules of Pacific ACOM, and in that moment, above the scattered islands and endless ocean, experienced pilots realize the balance of the air war is shifting, not gradually, but violently. That realization leads directly back to how the Pacific reached this point at all. By the opening months of 1944, the Pacific War had already burned through 2 brutal years of a combat. The sky above the ocean had become a proving ground where doctrine, technology, and pilot endurance were tested daily. But to understand why the arrival of the Corsair shocked Japanese pilots so deeply, the story must begin earlier, when Japan believed it already owned the air. In December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service entered the war with confidence bordering on certainty. Its pilots were among the most experienced in the world. Many had logged hundreds of flight hours in China, honing combat skills long before facing American opposition. Their aircraft reflected this philosophy. Fighters like the Mitsubishi A6 Mazero and the Nakajima Ki-43 prioritized maneuverability, range, and lightweight above all else. In the early months, these choices proved devastatingly effective. Across the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the skies above Pearl Harbor, Japanese fighters outturned and outclimbed most Allied aircraft. American pilots, trained in peacetime routines and flying heavier planes like the F4U Wildcat, found themselves outmatched in turning fights. Dogfights ended quickly and brutally. Aircraft burned. Pilots were lost. Survivors learned fast or did not survive at all. Japanese air doctrine reinforced this dominance. Combat emphasized aggressive engagement, individual pilot initiative, and close-range maneuver combat. Pilots were taught to trust their instincts and their aircraft's agility. Against opponents still learning how to fight a modern-day war, this approach delivered swift results. By mid-1942, the Zero had become a symbol of fire. Its long range allowed Japanese forces to strike far beyond expected limits. Its pilots appeared untouchable. In combat reports, Allied aircrews described being attacked from impossible angles, unable to shake pursuit. Morale suffered accordingly, but dominance carried hidden costs. Japanese aircraft were lightly armoured, often lacking self-sealing fuel tanks. Pilot protection was minimal. These vulnerabilities were accepted trade-offs. The belief was simple. Speed, agility, and pilot skill would prevent hits in the first place. For a time, this assumption held. Yet as the war stretched on, the environment began to change. American pilots learned to avoid turning engagements. New tactics emerged: high-speed slashing attacks, teamwork, altitude discipline. Encounters became less one-sided. Losses, once rare, began to rise among Japan's elite airmen. Still, even as warning signs appeared in 1942 and early 1943, Japanese leadership remained confident. Encounters often began without warning, an unseen threat diving from altitude, firing briefly, then vanishing upward. Survivors reported a sense of helplessness rather than defeat. There was no opportunity to demonstrate skill, no chance to recover position. Veterans who had survived years of combat found their instincts suddenly obsolete. Fatigue magnified the shock. By 1943, replacement pilots were arriving with fewer flight hours. Training time had been cut. Fuel shortages limited practice. Facing an enemy that attacked faster than they could react, many pilots froze momentarily, long enough for the Corsair to strike. The Corsair's strength was not a single advantage, but accumulation, speed, dive performance, armor, firepower. Each gap widened the margin for error. Japanese fighters could still outturn it, But turning no longer mattered when the enemy refused to engage. High-speed dives converted altitude into killing energy. Heavy construction allowed American pilots to commit aggressively, knowing they could survive return fear. The sound alone left an impression. The Corsair's engine roar was deeper, heavier, unmistakable. Japanese pilots learned to recognize it instinctively, often too late. Often too late, American pilots were instructed to avoid classic dogfights. The Corsair excelled in vertical combat. Attacks came from above, synchronized with informations. One aircraft fired, another covered. If chased, the Corsair simply climbed or dove away. Japanese formations fragmented under pressure, pilots breaking discipline in attempts to pursue, only to be isolated and destroyed. Copy. These tactics eroded confidence quickly. Each failed interception reinforced the reality that traditional responses no longer worked. Combat reports increasingly described enemy fighters beyond interception capability. Together, these angles formed a new battlefield reality, one that extended beyond the cockpit and into command decisions, enemy morale, and the psychology of the air war itself. Beyond the cockpit, the Corsair's influence reached into leadership decisions, enemy adaptation attempts, and the psychological fabric of the Pacific Air War. These deeper effects unfolded more slowly, but their consequences were lasting. Japanese air commanders faced an uncomfortable dilemma. Acknowledging the Corsair's superiority meant admitting that long-held doctrine was failing. Official responses initially emphasized pilot aggressiveness and tighter formations. Pilots were urged to close distance quickly and force turning engagements, a strategy that worked only when altitude advantage could be achieved first. But the Corsair denied that advantage. Its climb rate and speed made interception difficult. Commanders began issuing defensive instructions instead: avoid prolonged engagements, break contact if attacked from above, conserve experienced pilots. This shift marked a quiet retreat from offensive air doctrine that had defined Japan's early war success. Meanwhile, American leadership saw validation. Reports from Marine squadrons confirmed high kill ratios and survivability. Confidence spread quickly. The Corsair was no longer experimental. It became central to air superiority planning. From the American side, the Corsair altered pilot psychology in the opposite direction. Pilots who had once flown cautiously now pressed attacks. They trusted their aircraft to absorb damage and escape. Survivability translated into experience retention. Veteran pilots stayed alive long enough to refine tactics further, widening the gap with each engagement. The Corsair did not simply win fights. It allowed American pilots to choose them. For Japanese aviators, repeated encounters produced a creeping dread. The Corsair became associated with inevitability. Pilots reported seeing comrades shot down before they could respond. Others described diving away at the sound of its engine, abandoning missions rather than face interception. Morale suffered. Others stalled while climbing, only to be cut down from above. Radio transmissions captured confusion and panic. Formations dissolved. Coordination collapsed. The air battle ceased to be competitive. By this stage, Japanese aviation faced systemic collapse. Fuel shortages limited training. Replacement pilots entered combat with minimal flight hours. Against aircraft like the Corsair, this was fatal. Survivability dropped sharply. Experienced leaders were lost faster than they could be replaced. Okinawa, in early 1945, delivered the final confirmation. Corsairs dominated the skies over the island, intercepting aircraft before they reached American fleets. Even desperate tactics, including kamikaze missions, failed to overcome air superiority. Corsairs intercepted attackers at altitude, breaking formations long before they reached targets. For Japanese pilots, the Corsair came to represent inevitability. It appeared without warning, struck decisively, and disappeared untouched. Combat had become asymmetric. Courage no longer altered outcomes. Skill no longer closed gaps. By the final months of the war, Japanese pilots did not speak of defeating the Corsair. They spoke of avoiding it, and in that quiet shift of language lay the true turning point of the Pacific Air War, the moment when control of the sky passed permanently to the United States. That control would shape everything that followed, from battlefield outcomes to the psychology of those who survived. The consequences of Corsair dominance spread quickly across the Pacific theatre. Air superiority was no longer contested in key regions, it was enforced. This shift altered the rhythm of the war on land and sea alike. By late 1944, American ground forces advanced with an advantage that had been absent earlier in the conflict: reliable air cover, Corsairs strafed airfields, shipping lanes, and troop concentrations with near impunity. Japanese units, once accustomed to operating under friendly skies, now camouflaged, dispersed, and moved only at night. Loss figures reflected the imbalance. While exact numbers varied by engagement, combat reports consistently showed lopsided kill ratios in favour of Corsair units. More important than raw numbers was pilot attrition. Japan's remaining experienced aviators were being eliminated faster than they could train replacements. Each loss removed institutional memory, tactical knowledge, and leadership from squadrons already under strain. American forces, by contrast, retained veterans. Pilots who survived early encounters accumulated dozens of missions. Their experience translated into even more effective tactics. Survivability created a feedback loop. One Japan could not replicate due to fuel shortages, industrial limitations, and a shrinking training pipeline. Strategically, the Corsair helped secure critical airspace over island chains needed for the American advance. Bases could be constructed and supplied without constant air harassment. Naval operations faced fewer aerial threats. The cumulative effect accelerated the tempo of Allied operations. Japanese command assessments increasingly emphasized defense rather than recovery, and air units were reassigned, consolidated, or held back to protect remaining assets. Offensive air power, once a defining feature of Japan's early war success, faded into memory. Yet the Corsair's impact extended beyond strategy. It reshaped how Japanese pilots understood the war itself. Encounters that once tested skill now tested luck. Survival depended on avoidance rather than mastery. This psychological shift would linger long after the aircraft stopped flying combat missions. And it would become clearer still in the war's final phase. As the war moved toward its final year, the Corsair's influence became embedded in Japanese aviation memory. Post-war accounts from surviving pilots rarely described individual dogfights with pride. Instead, they spoke of sudden losses, overwhelming speed, and an enemy aircraft that dictated every engagement. The language changed. Where early war memoirs emphasized bravery and maneuver, later reflections emphasized inevitability. Operationally, Japanese air doctrine fractured. With fuel scarce and airfields under constant attack, training programs shortened further. Pilots were rushed to the front with barely enough hours to master basic flight, let alone combat against high-performance fighters. Against aircraft like the Corsair, this was catastrophic. Encounters ended quickly. Few lessons could be learned because few pilots survived long enough to learn them. American doctrine, in contrast, matured. The Corsair became a multi-role workhorse, interceptor, bomber escort, close air support platform. Its adaptability reinforced the American approach to air power, flexibility backed by industrial scale. By war's end, the aircraft symbolized not just superiority, but sustainability. A system that could fight, adapt, and continue. In Japanese records, the Corsair often appeared indirectly. It was described as a high-speed enemy fighters or a heavily armed naval aircraft, an acknowledgement that classification mattered less than effect. The precise model was irrelevant. What mattered was that it could not be countered with existing means. The long-term implications were clear. The Pacific Air War demonstrated that pilot skill alone could no longer compensate for technological disparity. Industrial capacity, training depth, and survivability had become decisive factors. The Corsair embodied this transformation. When the war ended, surviving Japanese aviators returned not as defeated knights of the air, but as witnesses to a fundamental shift in warfare, one where courage remained essential, but insufficient. That realization sets the stage for a final reflection on what the Corsair truly represented in the skies over the Pacific. The Vought F4U Corsair did more than win battles. It redefined the very nature of air combat in the Pacific. Its speed, firepower, and resilience forced a rethinking of tactics, doctrine, and expectation. For Japanese pilots, it was a harsh teacher, showing that skill and bravery could be overwhelmed by engineering, planning, and industrial scale. In the quiet after the fighting, the Corsair became a symbol of the new era of warfare. Dogfighting, once intimate and personal, had ceded to high-speed, calculated engagements. Air superiority was no longer earned through individual heroics, but achieved through a combination of technological advantage, coordinated tactics, and persistent presence in the sky. Yet, within its roaring engines and bent gull wings, there was also a human story. Pilots on both sides endured fear, fatigue, and the relentless calculus of survival. The Corsair did not remove these human stakes. It amplified them. Each mission tested judgment, courage, and endurance, reminding both attacker and defender that the skies were as unforgiving as the ocean below. History remembers the Corsair not merely as a machine, but as a turning point. Its appearance forced adaptation, accelerated the collapse of Japanese air power, and hastened the Allied advance across the Pacific. It stands as a testament to the intersection of technology, strategy, and human courage. A moment when the balance of war shifted not gradually, but in a burst of speed, fire, and determination. And in that shift, the Pacific sky would never feel the same again.